Send a human to a death world. Said, it will be a noble sacrifice to buy the fleet time, they said. The Galactic Concordat dropped Cadet Toby Henderson onto a toxic no return rock, expecting a static-filled scream, a heroic last stand, and then permanent silence. What High Command actually got was a choppy, low-res video feed of Toby holding a makeshift fishing rod, while Snorts, the galaxy's most lethal apex predator, sat beside him in the mud, waiting like a very good boy for a treat. Metal shrieked as the atmospheric friction peeled the outer heat shielding. From the drop pod, Toby Henderson gripped the restraint harness until his knuckles turned entirely white. His breathing shallow and rapid. Sweat stung his eyes, mixing with the sharp, acidic stench of his own vomit, lingering in the tiny cabin. He was 19 years old. He had joined the Concordat Auxiliary Forces to pay off his mother's orbital habitat debts, not to become a distraction. Gravity crushed his chest. The G-force compensators had blown out 3 minutes ago, leaving him to take the full brunt of the planet's aggressive pull. Just a reconnaissance drop, Commander Eiler had told him back on the cruiser, the alien's 4 compound eyes blinking in a steady, unsympathetic rhythm. You are human. Your biology is remarkably resilient. Establish a foothold on Xylos 9 and the extraction team will follow. It was a lie. Toby knew it the second they locked the pod from the outside. You don't send a lone cadet with a single ration pack, a distress beacon, and a standard-issue sidearm to establish a foothold. You send them as bait. Xylos 9 was a quarantine zone, home to carbon-based nightmares that had already chewed through 2 heavily armed Concordant platoons. Toby was just meat tossed into a cage to keep the monster busy while the fleet bypassed the sector. The pod slammed into the earth. Toby's teeth clattered together with enough force to taste copper. The harness dug viciously into his collarbones, bruising the muscle before the explosive bolts fired and released him. He fell forward, hitting the grated floor of the pod on his hands and knees. For a long time he just stayed there. He listened to the cooling metal ping and groan. He listened to the blood rushing in his own ears. Slowly he reached up and punched the manual release for the hatch. Pressurized gas hissed. The heavy door fell outward and hit the ground with a wet, heavy thud. Toby crawled out into a nightmare. The sky overhead was the color of a bruised plum, swirling with thick, sluggish clouds that looked heavy with grease. The air tasted like sulfur and burnt hair. Every breath scraped the back of his throat. He stood knee-deep in a spongy purple moss that released an odor like rotting cabbage. When his boots crushed it, he unholstered his pistol. His hands shook violently. He wasn't a hero. He was a kid from a hydroponics farm in the Detroit orbital ring. He didn't know how to survive in a jungle that looked like it was actively sweating acid. Toby moved back to the pod, his boots making sick sucking noises in the muck. He pulled out the heavy black cylinder of the emergency distress beacon. It was supposed to broadcast a hyperwave signal back to the fleet, transmitting his vitals and visual data. He slammed the spike of the beacon into the soft earth and punched the activation sequence. A small HoloLens popped up, glowing with a faint blue light. It blinked green. Transmitting, he stared into the lens. Somewhere light years away, a room full of Concordant officers were watching this feed, waiting to see how long it took for the local fauna to tear him apart. A sharp crack echoed from the tree line. Toby spun around, leveling the pistol. His heart hammered a frantic, irregular rhythm against his ribs. The trees here didn't have leaves. They had thick, leathery fronds that wept a clear, viscous sap. The shadows between them were impossibly dark. Something moved. It was massive, at least 8 ft at the shoulder. As it slinked out of the gloom, Toby felt his bowels turn to water. The creature looked like a cruel, evolutionary joke, a hybrid of a wolf and a crocodile built like a tank. Its hide was covered in jagged, charcoal gray scales, 6 deeply set. Yellow eyes locked onto him. Drool, thick and steaming, dripped from a jaw unhinged to reveal 3 rows of serrated teeth. Toby didn't run. His legs simply refused to work. His brain short-circuited, abandoning military training for sheer, unadulterated primate panic. The beast took a heavy, deliberate step forward. The ground actually vibrated. "Stay back," Toby whispered, his voice cracked. He sounded pathetic. He felt pathetic. He raised the pistol. The beast let out a low, rumbling growl that rattled Toby's sternum. It crouched, muscles coiling tight beneath the armor plating. And GT, snorts. And GT, it was going to lunge. In a blind panic, Toby dropped the gun. He reached into his chest rig, yanked out the only thing. His hand grasped a foil-wrapped, hyperdense synthetic protein bar and hurled it at the monster's face. The bar bounced off the creature's snout. The beast blinked, all 6 eyes shuddered in confusion. It looked down at the foil wrapper lying in the purple mud. Cautiously, it lowered its massive, terrifying head and sniffed. The creature took the bar, wrapper and all into its mouth and crunched. Toby stood completely still. He forgot to breathe. The beast swallowed. It looked back up at Toby. The murderous intent in those yellow eyes had vanished, replaced by a terrifying, intense curiosity. It sat back on its haunches, looking remarkably like a gargantuan, scaly dog, waiting for another scrap. Toby looked at the empty protein bar slot on his rig. He looked at the monster. He looked back at the blinking blue light of the broadcast beacon recording the entire interaction. He swallowed hard, the dry click audible in the silent jungle. "Well," Toby muttered, his voice trembling as a hysterical laugh bubbled up in his chest. "I guess we're doing this." Hunger scraped at the inside of his ribs like a rusted knife. 6 days had passed since the drop. 6 days of oppressive humid heat that made Toby's skin break out in an angry, itchy rash. 6 days of drinking filtered mud water that tasted strongly of aluminum. The fleet had not returned. There was no rescue ship. There was only the broadcast beacon, blinking its steady, indifferent blue light, silently streaming his agonizing survival back to the officers who had signed his death warrant. Toby sat on a half-sunken log near the edge of a wide, sluggish river. The water was a milky, opaque gray, thick as syrup. He picked up the broadcast beacon and set it on a rock, angling the lens toward himself. "Day 6, Toby said to the camera. His voice was hoarse, stripped of the terror from the first day, replaced by a numb, cynical exhaustion. He rubbed a hand over his face, feeling the rough, uneven stubble on his jaw. Or maybe 7, it's hard to tell. The sun here doesn't really set, it just kind of Gets tired and turns brown for a few hours. He picked up a long, surprisingly straight branch he had stripped of bark earlier that morning. He was currently tying a length of paracord salvaged from his drop pod parachute to the narrow end. For those of you taking notes in the Concordat Biology Department, your terrifying apex predator is a cheap date. Toby gestured behind him. A massive, armored head rested heavily on Toby's left thigh. The six-eyed beast let out a soft, rattling snore. It was warm, radiating heat like an industrial furnace. "Say hi, Barnaby," Toby said gently, slapping the creature's scaly snout. Barnaby opened two of his six eyes, let out a huff of air that smelled violently of rotting meat, and closed them again. Turns out Barnaby doesn't actually want to hunt if he doesn't have to, Toby explained to the lens, tying a crude, jagged piece of metal, a broken strut from the pod's console, to the end of the paracord. "He's lazy. The Concordat lost 2 platoons because you guys shot first. I gave him a stale synthetic protein bar, and he practically imprinted on me. We pack bonded, humans do that. We'll pet anything if you give us 5 minutes and 0 supervision," Toby finished the knot. He tugged on the metal strut. It held. It was an ugly, desperate fishing hook, but it would have to do. He reached into a tin cup sitting in the dirt and pulled out a fistful of squirming phosphorescent grubs he'd spent an hour digging out of a rotting stump. They felt like cold jelly in his palm. He speared a grub onto the metal hook. Pale blue goo oozed over his fingers. He wiped it off on his already ruined uniform pants. "I'm out of rations," Toby told the camera. He looked directly into the lens, his eyes dark and sunken, devoid of any military discipline. "I know you're watching. I know Zyler is probably sitting in his command chair, wondering why I'm not a pile of bones. Yet, here's the thing, Commander. You sent a human to die, but you forgot that we evolved on a rock where everything tried to kill us, and our response was usually to either eat it or domesticate it." He stood up. Barnaby grumbled, annoyed at the loss of his pillow, and shifted his massive bulk into the mud. Toby walked to the edge of the gray river. The air here smelled of damp ozone and something faintly sweet, like spoiled fruit. He pulled his arm back and cast the line. The heavy metal strut splashed into the thick water and sank immediately. "Now we wait," Toby said, sitting back down in the mud next to the beast. He didn't have to wait long. Barely 10 minutes passed before the paracord snapped taut. It didn't just pull, it violently jerked, nearly tearing the makeshift rod from Toby's blistered hands. "Whoa," Toby yelled, his boots sliding in the muck as he braced himself. Barnaby's head snapped up, all 6 eyes dilated. The beast let out a low, thrumming growl, watching the water. Toby leaned back, throwing his entire body weight into the pole. The cord cut deeply into his palms, burning the skin. Whatever was on the other end was heavy, and it was pissed off. The water churned, bubbling violently. "Help me out here, buddy," Toby grunted through clenched teeth. Barnaby didn't move to help pull, but he did stalk forward, stepping right to the water's edge, waiting. With a final desperate heave, Toby yanked backward. The water broke. A creature launched out of the gray sludge, thrashing wildly. It was easily the size of a golden retriever, but flat and wide, covered in a slimy, translucent membrane. It had no eyes, just a massive circular maw filled with inward-facing, needle-like teeth. It hit the mud, squelching loudly, and immediately began to snap its jaws, trying to drag itself back toward the river. Toby dropped the rod, breathing heavily, his hands stinging. Before the fish could reach the water, Barnaby lunged. The beast's jaws snapped shut over the center of the fish with the sound of a guillotine dropping. Thick, dark blood sprayed across the purple moss. The fish spasmed once and went completely still. Barnaby chewed loudly, bones cracking and popping like firecrackers in his mouth. He swallowed the bulk of the creature, then nudged the remaining third, the tail end meaty and dripping, toward Toby with his bloody snout. Toby stared at the raw, alien fish meat. His stomach violently contracted. It smelled like ammonia and old copper. He looked at the beacon. The blue light blinked back at him. Toby drew his combat knife, knelt in the mud, and carved a thick chunk of the pale meat away from the spine. He held it up to the camera, the blood running down his wrist. "Catch and cook, boys," Toby said, a grim, manic smile breaking across his exhausted face. "Smash that subscribe button, Zyler. I'm not dying today." Sparks refused to catch. Toby struck the magnesium fire starter against the dull edge of his combat knife for the 40th time. Scrape, scrape, scrape. Brief, pathetic flashes of white light flared and died instantly in the damp, suffocating air of Xylo's 9. His hands were trembling violently. The blisters on his palms from the parachute cord had popped, weeping clear, fluid and stinging with every movement. He cursed, a low, continuous string of profanities muttered through gritted teeth as he adjusted his grip and struck the metal again. "Survival training says to find dry tinder," Toby gasped out, aiming his voice at the blinking blue light of the distress beacon perched on a nearby rock. "Problem is, nothing on this godforsaken rock is dry. Everything is sweating. Trees are sweating. The dirt is sweating. I'm pretty sure the rocks are sweating." He dropped the knife and slumped back against the spongy, purple trunk of a massive fern tree. The raw chunk of river monster meat sat on a flat stone a few feet away already, attracting a swarm of tiny, iridescent blue insects that clicked like broken clockwork. Beside him, Barnaby snorted. The giant armored predator was lying on his side, watching Toby with 3 of his 6 yellow eyes open. The beast let out a deep, chest-rattling sigh that blew a cloud of sulphurous dust over Toby's boots. "Don't judge me," Toby told the creature, wiping a mixture of sweat and grime from his forehead. "You eat things raw. If I eat that raw, my intestines will probably liquefy." Toby swallowed, the lump of panic rising in his throat. It was getting darker. The bruised plum sky was deepening into a sickly, opaque violet. The shadows between the trees were stretching, growing fangs. The jungle was waking up. Distant guttural shrieks echoed through the canopy, followed by the wet, tearing sounds of something large being dismantled by something larger. He had to get a fire going, not just to cook the fish, but to keep the creeping dark at bay. He crawled forward on his hands and knees, ignoring the wet seep of mud soaking through his trousers. He dug under the roots of the fern tree, pushing past the weeping, sap-covered outer layers until he found a pocket of dead, crumbling wood that felt relatively crisp. He dragged a handful of the brown, fibrous material out and piled it over. Nest of dried moss he'd hoarded in his pockets all afternoon. He picked up the knife and the magnesium rod. He breathed in. The air tasted of ozone and decaying vegetation. Scrape. A shower of white sparks rained down onto the fibers. A tiny ribbon of gray smoke curled upward. Toby dropped the tools and leaned in close. He blew on the ember, a gentle, steady stream of air. The smoke thickened, smelling sharply of ammonia and burnt sugar. The ember glowed red, spreading across the moss, and then, with a soft woof, a small orange flame danced to life. He didn't cheer, he just let his head drop, closing his eyes as a wave of profound, exhausting relief washed over him, slowly, methodically. He fed thicker twigs into the tiny blaze, building it up until it crackled and popped, throwing a warm, wavering light against the encroaching darkness. "We have fire." "Chat," Toby said softly, glancing at the beacon. He grabbed a green, sappy branch, skewered the chunk of alien fish, and held it over the flames. "Take notes, command. Fire wards off predators." Though to be fair, having a 3-ton murder croc as a roommate probably helps. Mort. Barnaby shifted, dragging his massive, scaly chin across the mud until it was resting precariously close to the fire. Ring. He watched the flames with a lazy, hypnotic fascination. The fish meat began to sizzle. Gray grease dripped into the fire, causing the flames to flare a brilliant, unnatural green. The smell was atrocious. A harsh chemical odor that reminded Toby of burning plastic mixed with spoiled milk. His stomach cramped so violently, he nearly dropped the stick. He was starving, but his biological instincts were screaming at him not to put this in his mouth. He rotated the skewer. The meat turned a charred, crusty black. "On the outside, dinner is served," Toby muttered. He pulled the stick back and waited a torturous 3 minutes for the meat to cool. He looked into the camera lens. "If I die on stream from a ruptured stomach, I want my mother's habitat debt zeroed out. That was the contract you owe her." Toby bit into the meat. It was like chewing on a rubber tire soaked in battery acid. The texture was fibrous and tough, fighting against his molars. A sharp, intensely bitter flavor exploded across his tongue, followed immediately by a heavy, metallic aftertaste. His gag reflex kicked in instantly. He clamped a hand over his mouth, his eyes watering, forcing his jaw to keep chewing. "Swallow. Just swallow it." He forced the bullet down his throat. It hit his empty stomach like a lead. "Wait." He sat perfectly still, waiting for the agonizing cramps of poisoning to start. 5 minutes passed. His stomach gurgled violently, complaining about the abuse. But the nausea slowly receded into a dull, manageable ache. He wasn't dying. The food was awful, but it was calories. He took another bite. It didn't taste any better. But the primal, starvation-driven part of his brain demanded more. He ate the whole chunk, tossing the gristle and the improvised skewer into the fire. "1 star, Toby told the beacon, wiping his greasy mouth on his sleeve. "Atmosphere is terrible. Service is slow. Food tastes like a chemical burn. But the company..." He reached over and scratched the thick, leathery armor behind Barnaby's ear. "Slit." The beast leaned into the touch, letting out a low, vibrating purr that shook the ground. "The company is all right." He huddled closer to the fire, pulling his knees to his chest. The night had fully set in. Above them, the canopy blocked out any alien stars. Around them, the jungle rustled and clicked with unseen horrors. But here, in this tiny circle of light, a kid from Detroit and an apex predator from a death world settled into sleep. Atmospheric pressure dropped so fast, Toby felt his ears pop twice in rapid succession. It was mid-morning of his 9th day on Xylos 9, though the sky offered no sun to confirm the time. The perpetual bruised plum clouds had thickened, congealing into a heavy, bruised black that hung oppressively low over the canopy. The air grew completely still. The constant, maddening hum of the blue insects ceased entirely. Even the distant shrieks of the jungle predators were silenced. Toby sat up from his bed of scavenged fronds. The sudden quiet was more terrifying than the noise. "Something's wrong," he whispered, looking at Barnaby. The great beast was already on his feet. Barnaby's 6 yellow eyes were wide, the pupils dilated into thin, anxious slits. He was pacing in a tight circle, his heavy spiked tail lashing aggressively against the tree trunks, snapping saplings like dry twigs. He let out a high-pitched whining sound that felt completely out of place coming from such a monstrous throat. Toby grabbed the distress beacon and his combat knife. "What is it, boy? What's coming?" A single drop of liquid fell from the black sky. It hit the broad leaf of a fern directly above Toby's head. There was a sharp, aggressive hiss, followed immediately by a thin trail of acrid white smoke. A hole perfectly round and perfectly black ate through the thick vegetation. Another drop fell. It hit the purple moss 3 ft from Toby's boots. The moss turned black and dissolved into a bubbling gray sludge. "Oh, you have got to be kidding me," Toby breathed, his eyes widening in horror. Acid rain. The sky tore open. It didn't start as a drizzle. It unleashed as a torrential, roaring sheet of chemical death. Barnaby roared a sound of pure panic and lunged forward. His massive jaws snapped shut over the heavy webbing of Toby's tactical vest. Toby didn't even have time to scream before he was violently jerked off his feet. The beast dragged him. Toby bounced over the rough, spongy ground, his hands desperately clutching the distress beacon to his chest to keep it from smashing against the roots. The sound of the rain hitting the canopy above was deafening. A snort's million frying pans sizzling simultaneously. A stray drop slipped through the leaves and struck Toby's bare forearm. The pain was instantaneous and blinding. It felt like a white-hot needle driving straight to the bone. Toby screamed, a raw, ragged sound that was swallowed entirely by the roar of the downpour. Barnaby plowed through a thicket of weeping saplings, ignoring the hissing drops that splashed against his thick, charcoal-gray scales. The beast's armor seemed to resist the acid, but he was still desperate to escape. He scrambled up a slight, muddy incline and shoved his head into a massive, dark cavity beneath the exposed, chalky roots of a dead, colossal tree. He dragged Toby inside and dropped him in the dirt. Toby scrambled backward, hitting the back wall of the burrow. He clutched his arm. The acid had burned a dime-sized hole straight through his epidermis, exposing the angry, red muscle beneath. He grabbed a handful of loose, dry dirt from the burrow floor and aggressively packed it into the burn, hoping the soil would neutralize the chemical. He bit down on the collar of his uniform to keep from screaming again as the dirt ground into the raw nerve endings. Barnaby squeezed his massive bulk into the root cave, blocking the entrance almost entirely. The beast curled into a tight ball, his back to the opening, forming a living wall of scales between Toby and the lethal storm outside. Toby slumped against the dirt wall, panting heavily. The air inside the burrow was stiflingly hot, reeking of wet animal, dried earth, and his own blood. It was completely dark, save for the faint rhythmic blinking of the beacons. Blue light in his lap, he fumbled with the device, angling the lens toward his face. Weather update, Toby gasped, his voice shaking uncontrollably from the adrenaline and the pain. It's raining battery acid because of course it is, why wouldn't it? He pointed the camera at the solid wall of scaly muscle blocking the entrance. The sound of the rain outside was a terrifying continuous roar, like a jet engine permanently spooling up. I'd be dead right now, Toby said softly, staring at the camera, the cynical joking facade he'd been maintaining for the past week completely cracked. His eyes were wide, hollow, and terribly young. You dropped 2 platoons of armed soldiers here, command. They tried to fight this planet. They brought laser rifles and plasma grenades to shoot at the weather and the wildlife. He leaned his head back against the dirt, the packed soil grinding against his skull. You can't fight a planet, Toby whispered, his voice barely audible over the storm. You can only hide from it. And you can only hide if the locals decide to let you. He reached out his good hand and rested it on Barnaby's armored flank. The beast was breathing heavily, his sides expanding and contracting in a steady, reassuring rhythm. The scales were rough, like coarse sandpaper, but they were warm. I don't know how long this storm is going to last, Toby told the blinking blue light. I don't know if this burrow will hold, or if the acid will eat right through the wood and collapse the roof on us. But I'm still breathing, and I'm not fighting Xylos 9 anymore. We're just camping, we're just, he set the beacon down in the dirt, ensuring the light was still visible. He pulled his knees up to his chest, curled into a tight ball mirroring his alien protector, and closed his eyes. The storm raged outside, dissolving the jungle into sludge, while inside the cramped, suffocating dark, Toby listened to the slow, heavy heartbeat of the monster that had just saved his life. Moisture dripped steadily from the ruined canopy, a slow, toxic metronome, ticking away the hours. Time inside the stifling dark of the root burrow had melted into a feverish, suffocating haze. Toby woke to the sound of Barnaby shifting his massive bulk. The beast grunted, his armored scales scraping violently against the dirt walls as he slowly backed out of the hole. Pale, sickly light filtered into the burrow. Toby tried to push himself up. His left arm refused to cooperate. Fire lanced from his forearm all the way up to his collarbone, a deep, sickening throb that made his vision swim with jagged black spots. He looked down. The acid burn had swollen to the size of a bruised peach. The skin surrounding the crater was a furious mottled purple, weeping a thick, yellowish fluid that smelled distinctly of rotting meat and sulfur. Red lines spiderwebbed up his bicep, tracking the infection's rapid march toward his heart. He dragged himself out of the hole, his boots sliding uselessly in the melted gray sludge that used to be a vibrant jungle floor. The acid rain had reduced the waist-high purple moss to bubbling snorts, foul-smelling soup. The air was sharp, biting at his lungs with the tang of ozone and heavy chemicals. His boots kicked something hard, the distress beacon. He scooped it out of the muck with his good hand, wiped the lens on his filthy trousers, and set it on a half-melted stump day. Something, Toby croaked. His throat was so dry it felt like it was packed with ground glass. He swayed on his feet, a wave of dizziness forcing him to lean heavily against the dead tree. Medical update: the local weather is trying to dissolve me, and my own immune system is losing the ground war. He angled the camera down to his arm, letting the blinking blue light illuminate the horrific swollen wound. If any of the fleet's combat medics are watching, feel free to drop a hyperwave tip in the chat, Toby muttered, a breathless, humorless chuckle escaping his cracked lips. Because standard field manual says to amputate if red streaking reaches the shoulder. I'm right-handed, so losing the left isn't a deal breaker. But I don't really have a sterile bone. So, or anesthesia, or a clean bandage. Barnaby trotted over, his heavy footfalls squelched loudly in the chemical mud. The beast lowered his massive head, sniffing aggressively at Toby's infected arm. The creature recoiled slightly, letting out a short, distressed sneeze at the smell of human infection. Yeah, I know, buddy. I smell like a corpse, Toby whispered. He slid down the trunk of the tree until he was sitting in the sludge. His entire body was shivering violently, despite the suffocating humidity. The fever was spiking. Toby drew his combat knife. The dark metal blade was dull and chipped from scraping the magnesium rod. He stared at it. The rational, terrified part of his brain screamed at him to stop, to just lay down and let the fever take him quietly. The cynical, stubborn kid from the orbital rings told that part to shut up. He hadn't survived atmospheric re-entry, an apex predator, and an acid hurricane, just to die from a glorified sunburn. He pulled the magnesium fire starter from his chest rig. Command, Toby said, his voice dropping to a harsh, ragged whisper. He looked dead into the lens. His eyes were deeply sunken, bruised purple, underneath shining with a manic, feverish light. You wanted a show, you wanted to see. Conquered at grit. Here it is. He gathered a small pile of the dry, fibrous root material he had saved in his pockets before the rain. It took him 6 tries, his hands shaking so badly he kept dropping the striker. Before a spark finally caught, he blew on it until a small, smoky fire crackled to life in the hollow of the stump. Toby thrust the blade of his combat knife directly into the orange flames. He waited. He watched the metal heat up. He watched Barnaby pace back and forth, the beast letting out low, confused rumbles at the smell of the fire. Toby picked up a thick green twig from the mud and clamped it between his back molars. When the edge of the blade glowed dull, angry red, Toby pulled it from the fire. He didn't hesitate. If he hesitated, he wouldn't do it. He pressed the searing hot metal directly against the swollen, weeping crater on his forearm. The sound of his own flesh sizzling was deafening. It sounded like bacon hitting a hot skillet. White smoke plumed up from his skin, carrying a smell so horrifically sweet and rotten that Toby violently gagged around the stick in his mouth. The pain didn't register as pain anymore. It was a blinding white-hot physical force that completely overloaded his nervous system. Toby screamed. The sound tore through his throat, raw and animalistic, muffled only slightly by the wood splintering between his teeth. Barnaby roared in response, a deafening sound that shook the melted trees. The beast lunged forward, snapping his jaws at the empty air frantically, searching for whatever invisible enemy was hurting his human. Toby dropped the knife into the mud. He collapsed backward, his head hitting the dirt. His chest heaved. Blackness aggressively clawed at the edges of his vision. He rolled onto his side, violently retching dry, empty heaves into the sludge. The wound was a charred, blackened ruin. The weeping had stopped. The cauterization was sloppy and brutal. But the open crater was sealed. Barnaby pushed his massive, armored snout into Toby's chest, whining softly, nudging the boy as if trying to wake him up. "I'm okay," Toby gasped out, though his voice was entirely gone. He weakly patted the beast's scaly nose. "I'm okay. Just need a minute." He didn't get a minute. He closed his eyes and the fever finally dragged him down into the dark. Shadows stretched long and sharp across the melted earth. When Toby finally drifted back to consciousness, he was incredibly cold. His clothes were soaked with stale sweat and chemical mud clinging to his shivering frame. The fever had broken, leaving behind a hollowed out exhaustion that made his limbs feel like they were filled with wet cement. His left arm was completely numb, radiating a dull, heavy ache that pulsed with his heartbeat. He blinked against the gloom. The sky above was a starless, impenetrable black. A low, vibrating rumble vibrated through the mud beneath his spine. Toby turned his head. Barnaby was standing directly over him, a massive muscular canopy of charcoal gray scales. The beast was completely rigid, his 6 yellow eyes locked on the tree line. The low rumble wasn't a purr, it was a deep, chest-rattling warning. A sound drifted out of the darkness. Click-clack, squelch. Click-clack. It sounded like heavy fingernails tapping rapidly on stone, accompanied by the wet, sucking noise of feet pulling free from the mud. It wasn't just one source. And GT snorts. And GT. The sound was echoing from 3 different directions. Toby forced himself to sit up, his head spun wildly. He blindly groped the mud beside him until his fingers brushed the cold, hard plastic of his combat knife handle. He pulled it close to his chest. The blade was still coated in his own charred blood. "Beacon," Toby whispered frantically. He spotted the faint blue light on the stump a few feet away. He lunged for it, dragging his useless left arm, and pulled it into his lap. He angled it toward the dark tree line. "If you're watching," Toby breathed into the mic, his voice a hoarse rasp, "I think dinner just found us." 4 shapes slithered out of the gloom. They were horrifying. They looked like starved, hairless hounds stretched over a centipede's frame. Their bodies were long, pale, and segmented, moving low to the ground on 6 double-jointed legs. They had no visible, only a smooth, pale dome of a head. And GT snorts. And GT, that split completely in half to reveal a vertical, gnashing maw of needle-thin teeth. And GT snorts. And GT, they smelled the blood. They smelled the burnt flesh. They smelled weakness. The largest of The pale scavenger's clicked its jaws. Rapidly, a sickening wet sound, and rushed forward. Barnaby didn't wait for it to close the distance. The giant predator exploded into motion. Mud rained down on Toby as Barnaby vaulted over him, crashing into the lead scavenger with the force of a runaway freight train. Bones snapped instantly. Barnaby's massive jaws clamped down on the pale creature's midsection, violently shaking it like a rag doll. Pale, luminescent fluid sprayed across the dark mud. The scavenger shrieked a high, piercing, mechanical squeal, and then fell completely silent as Barnaby bit cleanly through its spine. But the others didn't retreat. They were starved, running on pure, frantic instinct. Two of the remaining scavengers flanked Barnaby, leaping onto his back. Their needle teeth scraped uselessly against his thick charcoal armor, but their hooked claws managed to find the softer skin between the plates. Barnaby roared in annoyance, twisting his heavy body to throw them off, his spiked tail lashing out to crush a nearby sapling. The fourth scavenger ignored the giant predator. It bypassed the chaotic melee entirely, its snort's blind head snapping toward the scent of infected, burnt blood. It scrambled straight for Toby. Toby couldn't run. His legs were completely dead from the fever and the adrenaline crash. He pushed his back hard against the stump, clutching the knife in his right hand. The pale creature lunged, its vertical jaws snapping open. Toby didn't swing wildly. He waited until the smell of rotting fish and ammonia washed over his face, until the creature was practically in his lap. He threw his right arm up, blocking the snapping maw with his thick tactical vest, and drove the combat knife upward, burying the 6-inch steel blade deep into the creature's pale, eyeless skull. The scavenger violently spasmed, its 6 legs thrashed wildly, raking deep bloody gouges across Toby's boots and shins. The creature shrieked an ear-splitting sound that made Toby's teeth ache before collapsing into a heavy, twitching pile of dead weight across his lap. Toby shoved the heavy carcass off him, panting heavily. His right hand was slick with pale, glowing blood. A heavy thud shook the ground nearby. Barnaby stood victorious over the other 2 mangled scavengers, his chest heaving. The snort's beast was covered in glowing blue scratches, but he looked deeply unsatisfied rather than hurt. He spat a chunk of pale meat out of his mouth in clear disgust. Barnaby turned, his 6 eyes locking onto Toby. He saw the dead creature at Toby's feet. The giant predator stalked over, lowered his massive head, and aggressively sniffed the carcass. Then he looked at Toby, let out a soft, approving huff of air, and sat down in the mud beside him. Toby looked at the dead alien. He looked at his bloody knife. He looked at the giant monster guarding him. He picked up the blinking beacon. "You see that, Xyler?" Toby said, his voice entirely devoid of panic, replaced by a cold, hardened edge. "They thought I was the weak link, but humans are pack animals. You threaten one of us." He leaned against Barnaby's warm, scaly side. "You fight the whole pack. Bring on day 10. Hunger stopped being a sharp pain around day 12. It transitioned into a cold, echoing cavern directly beneath Toby's ribs, making him feel light-headed and untethered from gravity. He sat cross-legged on a patch of relatively dry, chalky soil, picking at the crusty, blackened edges of the burn on his left arm. The swelling had gone down entirely. The skin was a hideous patchwork of puckered pink and charred gray. But the angry red streaks of infection had retreated. He had survived the amputation protocol. Now, he just had to survive the starvation. Barnaby was nowhere to be seen. The giant predator had wandered off into the dense weeping fern trees a few hours ago, leaving behind a trail of crushed vegetation and the lingering smell of ozone. Toby picked up the distress beacon. Its blue light was noticeably dimmer, the battery slowly giving up its long fight against the atmospheric dampness. Day 12, Toby said to the lens. His voice was soft, stripped of its previous bravado. It was just a tired kid talking to a piece of plastic. Or maybe 13. The fever scrambled my internal clock. Barnaby went hunting. He usually brings me the leftovers, but yesterday's catch was a giant shelled thing that smelled like pure bleach. I couldn't even force it down, so today we forage. He pushed himself up using a thick twisted branch he'd fashioned into a walking stick. His legs trembled. He had lost a terrifying amount of weight. His uniform hung off his frame in filthy, stiff folds caked in layers of dried chemical mud that flaked off like dead skin. With every step, he shuffled into the brush, keeping his eyes pinned to the ground. The jungle had recovered from the acid storm with frightening speed. New shoots, a vibrant sickly neon green, were already pushing through the melted gray sludge of the forest floor. Toby spotted a cluster of bulbous, melon-sized growths clinging to the roots of a dead tree. They were covered in a tough, waxy rind that secreted a milky fluid. He poked one with his stick. It felt dense, heavy. Command, my botany skills are limited to keeping a plastic ficus alive. In my bunk, Toby narrated, tapping the beacon strapped to his chest rig. But desperate times call for desperate dietary choices. He drew his dull combat knife and knelt in the mud. He carved into the thick rind. The flesh inside was a brilliant, startling magenta, layered like an onion. It smelled incredibly sweet, like overripe strawberries mixed with a hint of vanilla. Toby's mouth instantly watered. A sharp, violent cramp seized his stomach. His body was screaming at him to gorge on the sugary flesh. He raised the slice to his lips. A heavy snout suddenly slammed into his shoulder, knocking him sideways into the dirt. Toby yelped, dropping the magenta fruit. Barnaby stood over him. The beast snorted aggressively, blowing a massive gust of hot, rotting meat breath directly into Toby's face. He looked at the sliced fruit in the dirt, curled his upper lip to reveal his serrated teeth, and let out a sharp, sneezing hiss. With a heavy, deliberate swipe of his front paw, Barnaby kicked a shower of wet mud over the magenta flesh, burying it completely. Toby lay in the dirt, staring up at the six-eyed monster. Toxic? Toby asked, his voice shaking. Barnaby didn't answer. He just nudged Toby's shoulder with his nose, urging him to get up. The beast then turned and trotted a few yards away, pausing by a patch of unremarkable brown, spiky weeds. He dug his massive front claws into the soil, uprooting a cluster of pale, knobby tubers that looked remarkably like oversized ginger roots. Barnaby snapped one up in his jaws, chewed loudly, dirt and all, and swallowed. He looked back at Toby and let out a low, vibrating purr. Toby pushed himself off the ground. He walked over, picked up one of the remaining brown tubers and wiped the dirt off on his sleeve. It smelled like nothing. It looked completely unappetizing. He looked at the buried magenta fruit, then back to the ugly tuber in his hand. "Note for the survival manual," Toby muttered, holding the dirty root up to the beacon's camera. "When the giant death dog tells you not to eat the pretty fruit, you listen to the giant death dog." He walked back to their campsite, Barnaby trailing closely behind like a heavily armored shadow. Toby built a small fire using his magnesium striker and tossed the ugly tubers directly into the hot ashes. They roasted for an hour, the rough skins blistering and popping, releasing a mild starchy aroma that reminded Toby intensely of baked potatoes. He pulled one out with his stick, let it cool, and cracked it open. The inside was fluffy and white. He took a bite. It was incredibly bland, tasting mostly of ash and dirt, but it didn't burn his mouth. It didn't make his stomach violently contract. It was just dense, heavy carbohydrates. It was the best thing he had tasted in nearly 2 weeks. Toby sat by the fire eating the tubers in quiet, deliberate bites. Barnaby lay beside him, his massive head resting on his front paws, all 6 eyes slowly blinking in the warmth of the flames. Toby reached out and ran his hand along the thick, leathery armor of the beast's neck. Barnaby let out a heavy sigh, leaning his immense weight against Toby's side. "You know command," Toby whispered, staring into the flickering orange firelight. "You sent me here because you thought this planet was entirely hostile. You thought everything here just wanted to kill. But that's a human projection. We look at the dark and assume it hates us, but sometimes the dark is just hungry. And if you share your lunch, sometimes it shares back." He finished the tuber and closed his eyes. For the first time since he dropped onto Xylos 9, Toby didn't feel like prey. He felt like he belonged. Static crackled from the emergency beacon, a sound so unnatural in the organic symphony of the jungle that Toby nearly dropped his fire stick. It was day 15 or 16. The heavy, bruised plum clouds had finally fractured, allowing a few harsh, blinding beams of pale yellow sunlight to pierce the canopy. Toby was sitting by the riverbed washing his infected uniform pants in the gray sludge when the sharp hiss-pop of radio interference shattered the quiet. He scrambled up the muddy bank. The beacon, sitting on a flat stone, was no longer blinking its steady blue light. It was flashing a rapid, frantic green. Green meant a two-way handshake. Green meant a signal was trying to push through. Toby fell to his knees in the mud, grabbing the heavy black cylinder. His heart hammered a violent rhythm against his ribs. He pressed his ear to the tiny, waterproof speaker. "Dead. Hender. Repeat. Signal. Lock." The voice was terribly distorted, buried under layers of atmospheric interference and solar radiation, but it was undeniably human. It was the snort's crisp, clipped cadence of a Concordat comms officer. Toby jammed his thumb onto the transmit button. "This is Cadet Henderson. I'm here. I'm alive. Do you copy? Over." Silence. Then a wash of heavy static. "Topographic anomaly, grid 7. Unable to penetrate canopy, move to elevation." The transmission cut out entirely. The light flickered back to steady blue. Toby stared at the device. His breathing was shallow and fast. They were looking for him. The fleet hadn't entirely abandoned him. They had left an orbital relay, or a patrol ship behind, but the thick moisture-laden canopy of the jungle was blocking their sensors. They needed him on higher ground. He looked up. Through the breaks in the trees, he could see a jagged black ridge rising abruptly from the jungle floor, piercing the cloud layer about 2 miles to the east. It looked like a massive spine of obsidian jutting into the sky. "We're going for a hike, Barnaby," Toby said, his voice cracking with a sudden, desperate surge of adrenaline. He strapped the beacon to his chest, grabbed his combat knife and walking stick and started moving. Barnaby let out a confused grunt, abandoning a half-chewed bone by the river, and dutifully fell into step. Behind him, the jungle fought them every inch of the way. The terrain sloped sharply upward, the spongy moss giving way to slick, jagged rocks covered in a thick green slime that smelled like rotting fish. Toby slipped constantly, his boots worn completely smooth on the soles, found no purchase. His left arm throbbed a dull, constant ache with every jarring step. 3 hours into the climb, Toby hit wall. Literally, a sheer face of crystallized black rock blocked the path, rising 20 ft straight up. There were handholds, but the stone was slick with condensation. Toby leaned against the rock, his lungs burning, sweat stinging his eyes. He looked down at his ruined hands. He didn't have the upper body strength to pull himself up, not after starving for 2 weeks. He hit the stone with a closed fist, choked sob of frustration escaping his throat. Damn it, Barnaby nudged Toby's back with his massive snout. Toby pushed the beast away. "I can't climb it, Barnaby. I'm too weak." Barnaby didn't back down. The beast stepped right up to the rock, face turned sideways and lowered heavy, armored body, crouching as low to the ground as his thick legs would allow. He looked back at Toby, letting out a short, encouraging bark that echoed sharply off the stone. Toby stared. The beast was acting like a step stool. "You've got to be kidding me, Toby." Breathed, he stepped up, placing his muddy boot directly onto the thickest armor plate on Barnaby's shoulder. The beast didn't flinch. Toby grabbed a jagged outcropping of rock above, pulling with his right arm, and pushed off the monster's back. Barnaby slowly stood up, using his massive leg muscles to literally lift Toby higher up the wall. Toby scrambled, his fingers bleeding against the sharp crystal, until he managed to drag his upper body over the ledge. He collapsed onto the flat stone above, gasping for air. A moment later, Barnaby easily vaulted up the 20-ft wall with a terrifying display of predatory agility, landing lightly on his feet beside Toby. "Show off," Toby wheezed, smiling weakly. They reached the summit of the ridge just as the planet's murky sun began to dip toward the horizon. The view was staggering. An endless sea of purple and green canopy stretched out in every direction, shrouded in a thin, creeping mist. Toby unclipped the beacon. He held it up as high as his right arm could reach. The light immediately flashed green. "Cadet Henderson, we have your biometric lock. Hold position." The voice was crystal clear now. Toby dropped to his knees, a profound, shuddering relief washing over him. "I'm here. I read you, requesting immediate evac." "Evac is negative, Cadet." Toby froze. The air in his lungs turned to ice. "Repeat, I have survived. I established the foothold. Pull me out. High command." is impressed with your field data. Henderson, the voice replied, devoid of any emotion. Your biological interaction with the apex fauna confirms the planet's carbon structures are compatible with human colonization conditioning. And GT snorts. And GT, you have proven the ecosystem can be domesticated. Toby looked at Barnaby. The beast was sitting near the edge of the cliff, happily snapping at passing blue insects. However, the comms officer continued, the environment is too hostile for standard civilian deployment. The fleet is moving to Phase 2. We are deploying atmospheric incinerators to clear the grid. Your beacon is currently providing the targeting telemetry for the orbital strike. Toby stared at the black cylinder in his hand. It wasn't a distress beacon. It was a laser designator. He had carried the bomb directly to the highest point in the territory. ATA-2. Atmospheric ignition is 10 minutes, though. Radio chirped, your sacrifice will clear the way for millions. Cadet Concordat honors you. The transmission clicked off. Toby knelt on the black rock. The wind howled around him, cold and sharp. He looked down at the sprawling, toxic, magnificent jungle that had tried to kill him, and then fed him, and sheltered him. He looked at the giant, terrifying monster that had carried him up a mountain. He looked at the beacon. Toby didn't cry. The cynical kid from the orbital rings finally died on that ridge, replaced by something much harder, much quieter, and incredibly dangerous. He set the beacon on the stone. He picked up his combat knife. With one swift, brutal downward strike, he drove the steel blade directly through the center of the transmitting lens. Sparks showered over his knuckles. The green light died instantly. Toby pulled the knife out, stood up, and looked at Barnaby. The beast tilted his massive head, confused. Come on, boy, Toby said, his voice cold as the stone beneath his boots. He turned his back on the sky and started walking down the ridge back into the dark. We have a lot of work to do. Rain began to fall as they descended the obsidian ridge. But it wasn't the searing chemical death from before. It was just water. Cold, heavy drops plastered Toby's filthy uniform to his emaciated frame and washed the dried blood from his hands. He shivered violently, his teeth chattering in a rhythm he couldn't control. But his mind was absolutely clear. The fever had burned away his panic. The betrayal had burned away his fear. Command wouldn't just let a targeted strike zone drop off the grid. Zyler was a methodical officer. If the targeting laser went dark, Zyler wouldn't blind fire an atmospheric incinerator and risk missing the objective. He would send eyes. He would send a drone to find the beacon, verify the telemetry, and re-establish the lock. Toby needed that drone. He didn't stop to rest. He dragged his exhausted body through the dense, weeping fern trees, sliding down the slick, mud-covered slopes of the ridge until they reached a wide, relatively flat clearing near the riverbed. The air here was thick with the smell of wet decay and crushed snorts, purple moss. Hide, Toby told Barnaby, pointing to a dense thicket of pale, thorny brush. Barnaby grunted, shaking the cold rain from his charcoal gray scales. The giant beast didn't argue. He slinked into the undergrowth, his 3-ton mass disappearing into the shadows. with an agility that always made Toby's stomach tighten. Toby sat down in the center of the clearing. He pulled the smashed distress beacon from his rig. The lens was shattered, the internal optics ruined by his combat knife, but the solid-state memory drive in the base, the module storing 2 weeks of video and biometric data, was heavily armored. He unscrewed the bottom casing with his thumbnail, prying the small, rectangular drive out of its socket. He tucked it safely into his breast pocket. Then he lay back in the mud and waited. 2 hours passed. The rain turned the clearing into a shallow gray swamp. Toby's left arm throbbed, a dull and persistent ache reminding him of his limits. He focused on his breathing. He focused on the cold. A high-pitched oscillating whine cut through the ambient sounds of the jungle. Toby kept his eyes closed. The whine grew louder, vibrating in his molars. It wasn't the organic buzz of an insect. It was the sterile, frictionless hum of a Concordat anti-gravity engine. Shadow passed over Toby's face. He opened his eyes a fraction of an inch. A Scout-class reconnaissance drone hovered 20 ft above him. It was a sleek silver teardrop, completely alien against the bruised, vibrant colors of Xylos 9. A red sensor array blinked rapidly on its underbelly, scanning the ruined distress beacon lying in the mud. Toby's boots. The drone descended 15 ft. 10 ft. It was scanning for life signs. Toby held his breath, burying his hands deep into the cold mud to mask his thermal output. He looked dead. He smelled dead. 5 ft. The drone hovered just out of reach, its optical lens whirring as it zoomed in on Toby's face. Now Toby croaked. The underbrush exploded. Barnaby didn't roar. He launched himself from the thorny thicket in absolute silence, a terrifying blur of muscle and armor. The beast's massive jaws snapped shut around the silver teardrop before the drone's evasion subroutines could register the threat. Metal shrieked. Anti-gravity thrusters whined in a desperate failing pitch. Barnaby hit the mud, pinning the drone beneath his front paws. The machine sparked violently, arcs of blue electricity searing the beast scales, but Barnaby just pressed down harder. He crunched the rear propulsion housing, neutralizing the thrusters, and Snort spat the broken machine into the sludge. Toby scrambled to his feet. He lunged forward, drawing his combat knife, and drove the blade directly into the red sensor array to blind the automated defense protocols. The drone let out a dying mechanical wheeze and powered down. "Good boy," Toby panted, leaning against Barnaby's heavy flank to catch his breath. He dropped to his knees in the mud beside the ruined drone. His hands moved quickly, stripping away the damaged silver plating. He didn't know much about botany or survival, but a childhood spent in the maintenance shafts of a Detroit orbital ring had taught him how to hotwire Concordat tech. He ripped out the drone's local processing unit and found the hyperwave transceiver. It was intact. Toby pulled the memory drive from his pocket. He stripped the tiny copper wires with his teeth, tasting old blood and metallic dust, and spliced the beacon's drive directly into the drone's communication array. He bypassed the encryption loop, shorting the circuit with the tip of his wet combat knife to force an open channel broadcast. The transceiver hummed to life, glowing a faint, steady green. Connection established to the fleet. Overhead, Toby picked up the drones. Primary audiovisual pickup, holding the cracked lens up to his own face. He looked like a ghost. His eyes were hollow, his jaw covered in a patchy, dirty beard. His uniform was a rotting rag, and the crude, burn-scarred crater on his arm was prominently displayed. Behind him, Barnaby loomed, a six-eyed nightmare of fangs and armor. Chewing casually on a piece of the drone's casing, Toby hit transmit. He was pushing the entire 2-week data, dumped directly to Zyler's command console. "This is Cadet Toby Henderson," Toby said, his voice hard, flat, and entirely devoid of military respect. "I know you're receiving this, Zyler. I know you're watching the telemetry of your targeting beacon disappear. I smashed it. The orbital strike is cancelled." He wiped rain from his forehead, leaving a streak of gray mud. "I'm sending you my logs. You sent me here to die to prove this. Planet couldn't be tamed. But you didn't account for human stubbornness. I went fishing. I learned to cook. I cauterized an amputation level infection with a campfire, and I adopted the apex predator you were so terrified of." And GT snorts. And GT. Toby reached back, resting his hand on Barnaby's snout. The beast rumbled, a deep structural vibration that the microphone easily picked up. "Xylos 9 isn't a death world," Toby stated, staring dead into the cracked lens. "It's just a world, and it has a new management structure. Consider this an official eviction notice to the Concordant fleet. If you drop another soldier down here, they belong to the jungle. If you drop a bomb, I'll find a way to strap a hyperdrive to Barnaby and come bite the hole off your cruiser. Do not contact me again." He slammed the hilt of his knife into the transceiver, shattering it into pieces. The green light blinked out forever. Toby dropped the broken parts into the mud. He stood up, looking at the bruised plum sky just as the rain began to taper off. He was 19 years old. He was technically AWOL, stranded on an unmapped quarantine planet with no rescue coming. His stomach growled violently. "Oh, right," Toby sighed, turning away from the sky and looking at his scaly roommate. "The broadcast is out. Now we need to figure out how to catch those blind centipede things without getting stabbed. Let's go make a spear." Barnaby snorted in agreement, and the two of them walked side by side into the deep, welcoming dark of the jungle. If you enjoyed witnessing a stranded human cadet completely derail a galactic empire's military operation with nothing but pure spite, a makeshift fishing rod, and a 3-ton scaly murder dog, smash that like button. Subscribing and ringing the bell helps us keep the HFY stories flowing straight to your feed. What was your favorite moment from Toby's survival vlog? Would you have cauterized the wound yourself or taken your chances with the acid? Drop your thoughts in the comments below and share this video with someone who knows you can't ever underestimate human stubbornness. See you in the next archive.